Hello, everyone. Welcome into this session of How to Get Published with Taylor and Francis. We're really excited to have this workshop hosted for members only. It is an initiative of the Young Scholars Committee, alongside with the support, of course, with Caroline, Paulina, Wendy, the Online Events Committee. And thank you all for being here and devoting your time to learning. It is especially interesting event for young scholars, considering that we are starting or in the midway of our publishing journey. So today we will be delighted to have Elliot Mills, who is the portfolio manager and economics for the economics portfolio for Taylor and Francis. We'll be sharing very, very important insights of how to get published, how to even choose a journal and prepare your paper to be published. So with that, Elliot, you have the floor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks, Fania, and hello, everybody. I'm just going to jump right in to start by saying a little bit about myself. So I'm Elliot. I've been with TNF since 2017. I spent 5 years on the peer review team, and then that's working with things like peer review management systems, that sort of thing, submission systems. And then I spent the rest of the time as portfolio manager. So I've worked with researchers for a long time. I think gives me a good foundation to walk you through how to get published in a TNF journal. So with that ado, begin by sort of setting the stage. So where are you currently as a researcher? So you might have, a project wrapping up. You've got some data gathered, you've done some analysis, some initial analysis, and you've got some ideas for a paper. You might have several research questions and some rough notes and an outline. But I just really want to point out here that you really don't have to have a finished paper before you start thinking about submitting. So the process really on submitting an article starts way before the actual submitting. You might have done, like I said before, you've got some projects wrapping up and some data gathering, idea of paper.
Hello?
So I think the best place to start really before choosing a journal is this clarifying what your rough outline looks like. It's not necessarily written, but it might be based on grant proposal, preliminary analysis, background literature, discussions with colleagues. In other words, you've got a mental idea of what you want the paper or content to be. From an author's perspective, this is what your process looks like from the front end, that is submission. The end-to-end process in terms of an author doesn't get much longer than this. The only things after submitting really, unless you get revisions, is the publication. So that's things like signing author agreements, final proofing, and then publicizing your published paper. But really, once you've got a rough outline of your paper, you're ready to start searching for your journal of choice. So the first thing really you're probably asking is, how do I find journals? You can do a quick Google search for economics journals. You get lots of helpful results that way. Another way you could do it is looking on things like Web of Science or the JCR. It is worth noting that there's currently 587 journals listed in the Web of Science under the economics category, 381 of which are listed in the SSCI, which are much tougher requirements. 206 are listed in the ESCI, which is the Emerging Sources Citations Index. You could also, to find journals, look at citations of other similar content to see where that was published. Also, just going to publishers' websites, so TNF, Wiley, Elsevier, etc. We've all got big websites with thousands of journals between us. At the same time, there are a few things to consider when searching for your journal. So I think an important question to ask yourself is, who are you writing for? you're writing to an audience, so you need to customize your narrative to appeal to that audience. This is key for your first draft. So you might be looking at writing towards practitioners versus academics, and writing towards generalists and specialists. There's lots of different degrees in which your article might fit into those 4 things. It is far easier to customize your paper, obviously after selecting a few journals, but these are important things to consider before finalizing that draft. There are enough academic journals out there that cover all these 4 categories, so it's best to do a bit of research and find roughly where your paper sits. Again, publisher websites are great for scouting, especially those publishing lots of open access content, because that content's out there, it's not behind a paywall. And just read a lot of articles to sort of get a sense of the content those journals are publishing. Some other questions you can ask, in those early considerations for journals. What's your target audience? So again, generalist or specialist, but you can also look at what is the journal itself looking for. So you can find that on the aims and scopes. How high are you shooting? So, impact factor, for early career researchers, it's your first paper. You might have, be involved in quite a niche area where there's not a lot of research. High impact factor, very broad scope journals might not be the perfect home for that paper. And also ask yourself, would your paper be a good fit for any forthcoming special issues? So look for calls for papers, and I will touch upon all of these over the next few slides. So to touch upon the aims and scopes first, once you've shortlisted some journals, this is a great place to start narrowing down to the final few journals. If you've got shortlisted maybe 20 or 25, the aims and scopes really does help narrow it down. This slide here shows where this is on our platform on Taylor and Francis Online. So you can find those on the web page for the journal under About This Journal and the aims and scopes. And once you're on those pages, there's like a navigational list on the left-hand side. So you can get to the aims and scope there. All publishers have this. It's a statement of what the journal's seeking to publish and who its main audience is. It's often really short. Like for feminist economics, for example, you can get most of what the journal's about by that first paragraph at the top. It takes a couple of minutes to read. So reading this, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, it really could be the difference between getting an acceptance or a revision or a rejection in most cases. So reading the aims and scopes and kind of understanding it before you've submitted your paper, it's just really important to avoid that desk rejection. So just some more examples of how different some of these aims and scopes are. I've got 2 examples here in feminist economics and applied economics. Applied economics is literally a sentence, and there's an aims and scope. So really doesn't take long to find out just what these journals are looking for. It just describes the journal's scholarly focus and their intended target audience. So to follow on from this, answering those questions of what are you looking for, it really does depend on a short answer. Like I touched upon earlier, impact factor might be something that's important to you. And again, does impact factor matter? Again, it depends. It depends on the stage in your career, your goals. Your department might have requirements for publishing in a journal with a minimum impact factor, or your funders might have a requirement for submitting to a minimum impact factor. And also your paper, again, like I touched upon earlier, it could be a very niche area where there's not a lot of journals. So in that case, impact factor doesn't really matter when there's not many journals publishing in that field. One of the important things to pay attention to is the turnaround times of a journal, because they really do differ journal to journal. I mean, we've got journals in economics at TNF that can get a first decision in 30 days, but we've also got some that will take 6 months to get that first decision. So if you're under pressure by your institution to publish within a specific calendar year, either for tenure or something like that, these metrics are a good indication as to when you might see your paper accepted and published online, which will always be before a print issue. Most publishers are going this way, where your article's accepted and it goes online first before it's put into a print issue if the journal publishes in print. On the flip side to this, on looking whether or not impact factor, sometimes it really doesn't matter, as I touched upon. You know, there are other things you might be looking for that are far more important to you as a researcher, such as who's the editor of that journal, editorial board members, where they're based, who's the publisher. You know, you might have preferences towards certain publishers depending on things you might have heard in the news. You might want to look at who's already published with the journal, you know, other reputable scholars in your field, other people that you've worked with, you know, readership. You might want to look at the reach into the policy world. You know, if you're looking for a practitioner, there might be certain journals that you know just anecdotally that are in a lot of practitioners' hands. The peer review policy might be important to you. So looking at things like anonymization, the number of reviewers invited. The normal at TNF is that we invite 2 reviewers to every paper, but some journals invite 3, which can mean that it takes longer for your paper to get through review. You might also want to look at the submission process before, you know, deciding on your journal. So things like data policy, you know, certain journals have mandated data policies where you have to make all your data completely free, you know, which might affect your ability to be able to submit to that journal. Some journals have abstracts submitted followed by a manuscript submitted. So, you know, lots of things to consider. And also the open access policy might be the criteria that means that you choose this journal instead of that journal, for example. So there's some things to consider before choosing your journal. Some things to consider before you submit. As I've reiterated, you know, checking the journal's formatting requirements is just super important. You know, triple checking your spelling and grammar, reviewing past issues and articles, looking for calls for papers. You know, you might want to contact the editor if you're unsure if your paper fits. And again, check the turnaround time, because if you need a quick publication, a journal that's taken 180 days to get a first submission, first decision won't be a good place to submit to. It's worth noting that, again, editors' interpretations of the aims and scopes might not always align with yours. So if you are unsure about the aims and scopes, definitely contact the editor. I think that's a really important thing to do. While I've been speaking about calls for papers, again, you might want to have a look. So there's loads of journals running calls for papers at TNF. Journals are always actively recruiting submissions for special issues, and they're usually run by guest editors who are invited, who are experts in this area. It is a really good way to get your work recognised by and included with scholars in your own special area of research. For example, on the slide there's one special issue that feminist economics is running. If you look on our platform, and I'll share the slides afterwards so you can get links to all of this, all of these things I'm talking about on the Taylor and Francis website. But we currently have 121 calls for papers open in economics, finance, business and industry. So there's plenty of special issues out there covering pretty much any topic you can think of. And normally they publish faster. You know, there's normally a quicker turnaround time. So if there's one that fits your article, they're a good way to get a quick publication there. Things to remember during the process. If you do get a revise and resubmit decision, it's so important to keep the track changes and the response to the reviewers anonymous. Lots of authors forget that these things do get seen by reviewers, so forget to anonymize it when it's submitted. So it instantly just gets sent back, or if the editor's not got the time because they're receiving, some of our journals have got 2,000 submissions a year. They're not going to have time to send things back. So you just get a reject decision if you're not paying attention to those things. Editors aren't tech support. So if you're having trouble with the platforms, don't email the editors about them. Normally just email the publisher or whoever's hosting those submission sites. It is okay to ask for clarification at any step of the process, with the editor, with the actual tech support, and just pay attention to where things needed to be uploaded. Sometimes some authors think that certain files need to be uploaded after it's been accepted, and they tend to omit things that are important for peer review. So just make sure that you're uploading things where it needs to be. Some common rejection and unsubmit reasons, these tend to happen incredibly quickly. It's either you normally get a desk reject or it'll just be sent back to you. But making sure that you're not making these mistakes just gives you a better chance of getting your paper out for review. So like I said, anonymize your files correctly. So if it is double anonymous, make sure that there's no author names anywhere. Make sure that your paper is in scope. That's probably the quickest reason. The quickest way to a rejected paper is your paper's just not in scope. And likewise, you've ignored the requirements of the journal. But do remember, it's highly unlikely for a manuscript to be accepted in the first place it's submitted to. It's very rare for that to happen, especially with early researchers early career researchers that have never submitted before. But there is a journal out there for every piece of research, just by sheer volume of journals available. So some more things to consider with your papers is these are some top do's and don'ts. Again, I'll share the slides with everyone that's on the call. So I'm not going to go into all of these. But the two key points to pull out here, again, it's crucial to follow the information for authors and the instructions for authors, or whatever which publisher calls it. And it's just really important to adhere to them. I'd like to focus here briefly on title and abstract, as these are your article shop window, so to speak. So in your title and abstract, really important to summarize the results. Don't just list the topics to be discussed. Write what's new, what makes your research different at the very start. Use clear, concise language that could be understood by someone outside of your field. I've been to conferences before where editors have said, if you've got a partner, a sibling, or a colleague that's not an expert in your field, you can ask yourself, would they be able to pull some understanding from your abstract? If the answer is no, the editor probably won't be able to pull any understanding from it. So yeah, it might be worth a rewrite there. Really important is to include keywords within the first 65 characters of the title, as editors are doing work on all sorts of devices, and the first 65 characters appear first on most formatted web pages. So if they're reading an article or looking at the peer review site on a phone, the first 65 characters tends to be at the start. So make sure that you've got your keywords in that first 65 characters if you can. Avoid abbreviations, acronyms, numbers, and formula in the title. Think about how someone will search for your research. So what search terms will they use? Use these in your title and abstract to make your article more discoverable. And consider that most reviewers may be asked to decide whether they wish to review your paper on the basis of the title and abstract alone. They won't read the paper before deciding to review it. And if your article is accepted, and this is for the citations, abstracts are freely accessible in front of any paywalls, which means that they're fully crawled by AI and search engines, and they're accessible by anyone. Most readers read most of the abstract, but very few will read the actual full paper. So if your title and abstract is super tight, then you should have no problems there. Moving on to some ethical considerations, because in recent years, we've seen an increase from a publisher's point of view in ethical issues in journal publishing. So things from redundant publication and salami slicing to ghost and gift authorship. So some of these things that I list here, things that publishers are really looking into, and ways around these is to just always ensure that you're referencing your own work as well as anyone else's work. I know this is, pretty much basics of academia 101, but you'd be surprised at how many authors sort of fall short on this. Again, it's an easy way to have your paper rejected if reviewers catch it, if editors catch it, and if it's published, it's you potentially putting yourself at risk to having things like retractions. Number two, only have your paper under consideration by one journal at any one time. Submitting to more than one journal means that a number of reviewers could be reviewing the same paper needlessly, and it could be going through the publication process at two different publishers. It becomes a real problem if your article is accepted in two different places because you can only publish in one of them. What this tends to lead to is your article is withdrawn from both of them because the fact that you've not considered this policy is a policy at most publishers and most journals. Ensure contributors to the research are acknowledged properly, and keep them in the loop. Whether you're the corresponding author or co-author, make sure you know where the research is being published. Just because you're a co-author and you've got a corresponding author doesn't mean that you need to be kept out of the loop of everything. It's best just to make sure that everyone that's been associated with an article, that's worked on an article, is in the know at every stage in the process. Declare any potential conflicts of interest. Again, that's pretty simple. If your research involves human participants, you'll need to include a statement about your ethics board approval. So why the ethics board approval was not required if you've not got it, e.g. not applicable in your country. And the last thing is you can get copyright issues if you've not checked to use permission for third-party materials. So make sure that if you've got any third-party materials, just have written permission so that you can pull it up at any point. And we do have a very large resource in our Ethics for Authors page. There's vast quantities of information on there about lots of different ethical considerations for authors. So definitely worth checking that out before you submit. I've put this slide in because when I've been to conferences, things on AI get a lot of questions. So the three things that I list here on the slide, AI tools such as ChatGPT can't be used as a co-author. All authors they're wholly responsible for the originality and validity and integrity of the content of the submissions. And if using an AI tool, so important to acknowledge it. Again, when I share around some slides, there's quite a few news articles that TNF's published, and there's some YouTube videos that were done by Scholarly Kitchen discussing, the use of this technology. But yeah, I think the most important thing is anywhere where a tool's been used, just to acknowledge it, because of the fact that lots of publishers, it's up in the air exactly what's acceptable. So I think if you acknowledge it, you just you cover your back in that regard in case policies change. You can fall back on being completely transparent. The next thing to look out for as an early career researcher is looking out for illegitimate publishers and journals. I'll start out by quoting David Crotty, who is one of the executive editors for the Scholarly Kitchen, and he's the editorial director for journals policy at OUP. Basically, don't submit your paper to a journal you don't or wouldn't want to read. Predatory journals and publishing agencies do try to fool authors with all sorts of means, and thousands of authors every year fall prey to these publishers. I think another tip is, if you've never heard of it, read a few issues before submitting. That's a good way of finding out whether or not this hoax content, that sort of thing. I do want to point out some tips on how to spot predatory publishing practices. Worth noting that these shouldn't be taken on their own. If these are in combination with each other, chances are there is it's a predatory publisher. So things like surprise fees. So if all fees for a journal should be advertised at or before submission. So this should be clearly labeled what you're going to be paying on the instructions for authors, where you're submitting on the platform. It should be clearly specified how you're going to pay and what those payments are. If you're unsure of a journal, you can check things like the Beals list, which is a list of thousands of journals identified. I think it comes from an institution in South Africa, but don't quote me on that. He's put together this massive list of all these journals that have got predatory practices, that are there for catching authors off. Look at the CAS ranking. That's Chinese Academy of Sciences. Also, if the journal's on a reputable platform, if it's on, for example, Taylor & Francis Online, Wiley, Frontiers, one of the big publishers, a lot of these, things like fees are up front, policies are clear. We do screen editors, reviewers, and that sort of thing. The last thing I'll point to on this slide is the speed of peer review, because in combination with things like surprise fees especially, be very cautious of journals who promise rapid peer review times. The average review does take 30 to 40 days to complete. So if you've got a journal saying they can get a review to you in 2 days, it's probably not worth submitting to. Moving on to open access. This is the last thing that I'm going to cover today. So if your institution or grant funding covers it, definitely consider publishing OA. It still goes through regular peer review, but the article is available to everyone once it's been accepted. Open access articles generally receive far more citations on average than standard articles. And just to give you some figures about the growth in OA, there were 20,600 fully OA published articles in economics in 2023, out of a total of 74,000 articles published in economics journals in 2023. The biggest funders, or the regions where there was the most funders, came from China, US, and EU, with 1,096 separate funding bodies coming from China alone. Really important to speak to university to find available funding. They're normally the best place to go to see if there's any funding available for OA. Lots of institutions these days offering open access funding via what we call a read and publish deal. So that's where your institution's library has paid for X amount of open access articles with a specific publisher per year, in exchange with access to read content. So that's content behind paywalls. So definitely speak to your libraries to find out what funding's available there. There's loads of resources to cover everything that I've spoken about. today, but I'd like to highlight our author services page. It houses lots of guides on reviews, authorship questions, OA sales deals, like I touched upon. There's the full list of every institution that we're dealing with there. You can look at waiver policies, because if you're in certain countries, you don't need to pay an APC to cover your OA publication. There's also guides on how to complete an author publishing agreement and that sort of thing. I've touched upon Scholarly Kitchen quite a lot in this presentation. They keep up to date on the latest developments in academic publishing. They frequently discuss many of the hottest topics like OA, sales deals, predatory publishing practices to watch out for. So it's definitely worth signing up to their mailing list. There's a new article that they publish every day. And the last thing I want to point you all towards is our Inclusive Economics Prize at Taylor & Francis, worth £4,000 a year to the winner. Its aim is to look at challenging mainstream thinking at a time when the importance of diversity and inclusion has never been more pertinent. Publishing research which combats elitism, marginalization, things like that's of paramount importance to us. And this is just one of those ways that we're helping to do that. And we want to encourage, promote, and help fund research which is inclusive. That's inclusive of diversity, plurality, new approaches. So definitely go out and check the prize for this. I believe this year it's closing around October. We have chosen to extend it past the deadline in previous years to ensure that we get as many submissions as possible. But there's links to this when I share around the presentation, so you can go and read about previous winners. You can go read about what you need to do to submit to that prize. And of course, some of you might not be looking at publishing an article. You might be wanting to publish a chapter in a book or publish towards a book. Everything I've covered is more tailored towards journal publishing, but we do have sessions like this run by colleagues in our books department. And there are some major differences to consider there. So definitely worth checking out those sessions and those resources there if you're looking to publish in a book. But I can share all the research resources with you on that after this presentation. And like I said, I'll send the slides around to all attendees. So yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. And I guess I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Elliot, for all of the insights that you've shared. We do have plenty of questions in the chat. I've tried to group them. Some of them you were answering along the way, so I'll leave those behind. But for instance, there's a lot of questions like, okay, if your aim is to someday publish in a journal like Feminist Economics, should we look for other journals covering feminist economic issues first, especially if you are not a established researcher, mid or senior career? And if so, where can you find a list of those journals, like by topic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say yes. I think it's always better to just give yourself more options. If you are really keen on submitting and getting published in feminist economics, obviously follow all the instructions that I've given you. Make sure that it's tailored to the aims and scopes. But really, it's a lottery getting your article accepted in any journal. I can't remember the acceptance rate of feminist economics. I think it's around 14%. So with that in mind, I think it is best to consider other options. It's better to have a published paper than have not a published paper, really. In regard to finding a good list for those, Taylor & Francis online, so TNF's website is a good place to look. There's lots of filters when you're searching. Looking at where, as I touched upon earlier, looking at the reference list for articles published in feminist economics, they'll be referencing papers in other journals. So that's a really good way to find other journals in that field, because they're not solely going to be referencing papers that are just published in feminist economics. They're going to be referencing content and articles that are published elsewhere that are to do with the similar field. So yeah, I'd say reference lists is probably the second best place to look. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it's something that came up earlier as well, that if you could speak more about how can we know journals that have higher acceptance rates, or is that public information or something that mainly editors know?
It is. So the acceptance rate usually is public information. Journals at TNF, I can speak upon Taylor and Francis. I don't know what other publishers' policies are around this, but Taylor and Francis, we don't force editors to publish the acceptance rate. Editors can opt out of it, but I'd say 90% of our editors opt in to have that there. Yeah, normally it's the journal homepage is the best place to find the acceptance rate. Emailing the editors if they've not published that information sometimes can get you an answer, but sometimes editors just won't. They'll choose not to respond to that sort of question if it's not publicly known.
Thank you, Elliot. So on that, they ask if journals always send a reply, or is there sometimes that you never hear back and you just assume you can continue to submit elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, all of the journals I work with, they do send back. You'll always get a reject decision that will have, some feedback. That feedback's not always excellent, and you can't always know how to improve from that feedback. Like I said earlier, some of our journals are going through 2,000 submissions a year, and that's on top of their working academics as well. So they're doing the journal on the side. So for a lot of our editors, there's just not the time to provide comments. I think if you are really paying attention to the instructions I gave throughout, making sure that you follow the instructions for authors, making sure your paper's in scope as far as you can. I do understand that sometimes it's quite difficult to get your paper in scope. I think if you follow those instructions, you're more likely to get your paper into review, at which point, when it's rejected, it will have reviewer comments on, usually. Desk rejections, I've got editors that do try to put comments on every rejection, but it's not guaranteed sometimes just because of the volume.
Thank you, Elliot. So on that, we have a lot of questions, like 2 topics especially. One is about, well, are there journals that are not open access and do not require payments? So open access is usually free, from my experience, but they're asking on that, especially for the Global South, that we have less financial support to publish.
Yeah, so depending on what country you're in, at TNF, we do our waivers policies set by World Bank. So if your country's in a band B country, you get 50%, and if it's in a band A, you get 100% discount on the APC. But there's lots of journals. I mean, we've got 2 journals in the TNF portfolio that charge a submission fee, but there's no fees to actually publish. There's normally not a waiver on any submission fees because they're normally set far lower than the APCs. But there's lots of journals where there's absolutely no fees whatsoever. There's plenty out there. Most journals actually don't have any fees.
Is that something that we find in their website, or is that disclosed at some point?
That should be. So the things around the waivers is all on our author services page. And also for TNF journals, especially, all of the payments and how to request a waiver and things like that is on our information for authors pages. So when you're on the journal homepage and there's the instructions to follow, there's always a section there about what fees are applicable. And within that section, there's always a bit about how to apply for a waiver.
Thank you so much for that. And the two other topics that we have is first on anonymizing. If there's any special guidelines that we could follow, like that we can find on a website to be sure we're submitting anonymously for review. And the other has to do mainly with ethics, more of how should we quote using AI assistants like Grammarly or Quillbot, not actually like
So
writing everything on ChatGPT, but using some assistants to review.
yeah, those assistance ones, I'm going to start on that one actually. The things like Grammarly and those kind of assistive technologies, we don't, as a publisher, require you to we don't expect authors to clarify and acknowledge that they've used things like Grammarly. I mean, to us, that's no different to using like a language editing service that's done by, a professional language editor, because it's the only difference is a machine's doing it. Where it becomes difficult is where, you might have used AI to generate data sets, or you've used AI to actually write some of the paper, by using prompts in ChatGPT. There's lots of cases that things like Scholarly Kitchen have done reports on, where they've found papers that have been almost entirely fully authored using ChatGPT prompts, and they've not been acknowledged, but the editors kind of have worked out ways to kind of pick it up. The thing is, these machines are always getting better. They seem to be always one step ahead of the editors, one step ahead of us, which is why we really need authors to kind of acknowledge where they've used it. And I think for that reason as well, that's why kind of publishers' policies around it are up in the air. No two publishers got the same policy around it, which is why I think it's just easiest to just acknowledge it. Because like I said, some of the policies are changing on a weekly basis. So if you have acknowledged it, regardless of whether or not the policy changes, at least at the point of submission, you can say it was fully acknowledged. And at the point of submission, this was the case. But if you don't acknowledge it and it's kind of caught later, that's when, the problems with things like retractions happen, potentially. The other thing, so to answer the other question about anonymization, there's lots of information on our author services page, but really the easiest thing to do is just to make sure that all of your files you have, when you're getting your files ready to submit, just have a file ready that's got all the author information removed, because that way you can't get caught out on it. And if you've got any kind of inkling that one of your files is going to be reviewed, just make sure it's got no author names on it. That should cover you in 95% of the cases. Some journals do have interesting anonymization policies, so it's best just to check the journal instructions on what they are. At TNF, it's basically is fairly standard. It's very standard. So the instructions for one journal will pretty much be the same for most other journals. But yeah.
Thank you, Elliot. And on that, they also ask about the statement of ethics. From my experience, it's usually a separate letter that you submit with your paper. But
Yeah.
they're asking where should you put that, and also including acknowledgement of AI tools in the case of.
So the best place to do that, so the AI tools, I think it would probably be, and it would probably differ from journal to journal, but from my point of view, I think it'd be best to put that where reviewers can see the acknowledgement. So you'd want to, so when you upload files to a lot of our systems, you can designate what that file is. So things like supplementary material for review, main manuscript with author details, that sort of thing. The acknowledgement, if it's the AI, I'd make sure that it's specified that it's a supplementary material for review, as long as it's anonymized, of course, just so that the reviewer looking at it can see that AI tools have been used for some kind of generative purpose. And then the reviewer can make the decision as well on that. Because some reviewers will be completely fine with it. Some reviewers might hate the fact that it's there. But if you've acknowledged it, again, you can't get in trouble later down the line. Things like ethics statements, normally they need to be supplied for review as well. But again, as long as they're anonymized. Things like data availability statements as well, they need to be accessible for the reviewers in case the reviewer needs to replicate any data as part of their review. So yeah, for most of these things, best to send it for review. But again, on all our author services page, there's full information on that.
Thank you so much, Elliot. I see that transparency goes a long way.
Yeah.
Always anonymizing everything you send and getting on the scope of the journal. So they actually review, and if you get rejected, you get some answers, right?
Yeah.
I see we have one hand up. We can take one more question. Ari, if you want to take the floor briefly or write in the chat, please.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I have a disability, so it's difficult for me to write into the chat. But
Okay.
my question is, I have two if it's possible, but so basically one is if the turnaround time is not published for a journal, what would you recommend doing? Is it possible to email the journal? And second is how to avoid self-plagiarizing and also keeping the work anonymous in the case that you want to cite a paper of yours that you know is forthcoming but hasn't been published yet.
Okay, I see. So the first question on turnaround times, best thing to do if it's not published is email the editor. Sometimes there's equally an editorial office address as well. Sometimes that's on the information for authors page. So there might be, like a journal admin that works on the journal alongside the editors that might have that information. Again, it's up to their discretion on whether or not they share that information. Most TNF journals will, but I can't speak for other journals. It just depends on the policy of the publisher or whoever owns the journal, whether or not they want to publicize that information if it's not been made publicly available. And I'm terribly sorry. Would you mind repeating the second question again? Would that be okay?
Oh, yes, thank you. My question is, how do you, so for example, if you are submitting an article and you've made sure that you've anonymized everything, but you are going to cite a paper of yours or work of yours that is forthcoming, how do you not compromise the anonymity but also not self-plagiarize? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So the anonymity there, I mean, depending on the field you're publishing, there's some fields where it's pretty much impossible to avoid the anonymity because of the nature of the work. You might be one of very few scholars that are the expert in that field. So it's more about doing your best really to anonymize it. So not having your author names and your institution at the very top of the article, citing your own work, depending on the volume of it, that shouldn't really, break the anonymity policy. And I think if you're referencing and citing your own work to the extent where it might break the anonymity policy. I think it's worth questioning whether or not you've been broad enough in your citations and referencing other work. We do have some guidelines on self-plagiarism and tips for sort of getting around it on our author services page, if that hasn't quite fully answered your question.
Okay, thank you so much.
No worries.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all the thoughtful questions, and Elliot, for your patience and all of the knowledge that you have shared with us today. Do know everything has been recorded, and as Elliot has said, we will also share the slides with everyone that registered. It is a members only event, so it won't be widely published in our YouTube channel, but you will receive it via email and in the member section of IAFFE website. So with that, really wish everyone a good rest of your day or night, depending where you are. And please do see Wendy's comment in the chat from the online events committee. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Elliot. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to have you. And thanks, Caroline, for the connection.
Yeah, thanks, Fanny, for
Thank you for your great moderation. And yes, Elliot, I have my camera off, but